A dramatic scene unfolded at the United Nations General Assembly when a mass walkout took place during Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's address, a stark signal of the global community's intensifying disapproval of Israel's recent military actions. The mass exodus came as Netanyahu sought to justify the deaths of over 41,000 Palestinians in Gaza over the past year and hundreds more in Lebanon in the last week, events that have drawn widespread condemnation. For many, this walkout symbolized a rejection of what critics are increasingly labeling as genocide. The spectacle of diplomats filing out of the hall, broadcast widely on social media, underscored the growing isolation of Netanyahu's government. Even as Netanyahu spoke to a room dotted with empty seats, the carefully choreographed cheers of his invited supporters could barely mask the swelling international dissent. Al Jazeera's Rami Ayari pointed out that most of the applause came not from world leaders, but from those Netanyahu had specifically invited to the event. The protest against Netanyahu wasn't confined to the walls of the UN. In Manhattan, just a day earlier, 25 demonstrators were arrested for blocking the Israeli Prime Minister's motorcade in opposition to his policies. Nihad Awad, the National Executive Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, did not mince words. He emphasized that Netanyahu's far-right government, which many accuse of perpetuating genocide in Gaza, is rapidly transforming Israel into an international outcast. Awad's pointed message to U.S. President Joe Biden highlighted America's diplomatic isolation, warning that continued support for Israel, without acknowledging Palestinian rights, undermines both the U.S. and Israel on the global stage. Meanwhile, Israel's military actions have continued with American support. In the aftermath of Hamas's attack on October 7th, the U.S. administration has provided Israel with billions of dollars in military aid, while publicly pushing for a ceasefire. Despite the calls for restraint, the Biden administration has stood by Israel in opposing UN resolutions critical of its response. Trita Parsi, from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, highlighted the dangerous path the U.S. is on, noting that unconditional backing from the Biden administration has allowed Netanyahu to lead Israel into deeper global isolation. The walkout echoed a broader wave of discontent. Slovenian Prime Minister Robert Golob's urgent plea to Netanyahu during the UN Assembly to stop this war now highlighted the growing international clamor for peace. In his address, Netanyahu, unwavering in his defiance, responded to such criticism by accusing his global counterparts of spreading lies and slanders against Israel. His speech, filled with promises of war against Hamas until total victory, reflected a leader entrenched in a war posture, using his platform to pledge retaliatory strikes against Iran while branding Israel's enemies as savages. For many, Netanyahu's rhetoric underscored a dangerous paradox. A leader, accused of committing genocide, now using the world's most prominent stage to paint his enemies as existential threats. James Zogby, president of the Arab American Institute, aptly captured the frustration many felt, calling Netanyahu's speech an abuse of the General Assembly platform to lie and incite. The consequences of these actions are already playing out on the world stage. Israel is now facing a South Africa-led genocide case at the International Court of Justice, ICJ, with the International Criminal Court, ICC, also seeking arrest warrants for Netanyahu, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and 3 Hamas leaders. With one of these Hamas leaders already killed by Israel in Iran, an act that escalates the conflict further, the stakes of this conflict only continue to rise. What was meant to be a defense of Israeli policy became, instead, a moment of profound isolation for Netanyahu and his government. As world leaders walked out and protests continued, it became clear that the global community's patience with Israel's actions is wearing thin. The walkout at the UN was not merely a symbolic gesture, it was a stark reminder that, for many, Israel's current course of action is rapidly leading it down a path of pariah status. The question now is whether anyone is willing or able to change course before it's too late.